Power of God's grace. That's the topic of today's Bold and Blunt. I'm your host, Cheryl Chumley, giving you a Christian conservative look at today's news, politics, culture, and events. Only 2/3 of American adults nowadays identify as Christians. That's according to a 2022 survey by Pew Research Center, the same research center that conducts in-depth polls and surveys and looks at the religious landscape of America. And this is important for America because, first off, we were founded on Judeo-Christian roots. So the more and more we stray from Christianity, the more and more we stray from what founding fathers intended this nation to be based upon, that is to say, Judeo-Christian principles. But there's a bigger reason as well, a spiritual reason. And if you're not a Christian, if you're not a believer, if you don't have a faith rooting you in this chaotic life, then how do you deal with things that come up? How do you navigate the perils and darkness that pop up every day? How do you even read or watch or digest daily news without going into a nail-biting time? Right? You need something. You need something that roots you, that steers your ship, that doesn't make you so vulnerable to the winds of change. And that's faith. And since it's Christmas time and the season of Christ, it seems the perfect time to talk about faith. And before I get into that, I want to quickly mention, if you like Bold and Blunt, you may get Bold and Blunt at edify.app, at Real Life Network, which is a network of faith-based news. It's run by Pastor Jack Hibbs's Real Life Network out in California, where they take all these voices that cover news from a biblical perspective, and they put it on a platform and they offer it for those who are facing dark times and want to understand how to make sense of today's world. So it's a great place to get your news. Real Life Network, like I said, RLN. You may also get Bold and Blunt at WashingtonTimes.com, where regular listeners know this is the part where I say you can sign up for my 3 times a week newsletter. It comes out Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Just go to WashingtonTimes.com. The bottom of the page has a newsletter link. Click on it, and you will be taken to a page with all the newsletters that Washington Times offers. Mine is called Bold and Blunt with Cheryl Chumley. If you sign up for it by entering your email address, you will get delivered to your email box Monday, Wednesday, and Friday my newsletter, Bold and Blunt with Cheryl Chumley, and it contains my commentaries, my Bold and Blunt podcasts, and whatever video versions of Bold and Blunt I do that week. You may also get Bold and Blunt, of course, wherever podcasts are available. Let me read a little bit from this Pew Research survey, again, 2022. How U.S. religious composition has changed in recent decades. Only a few decades ago, Pew writes, a Christian identity was so common among Americans that it could almost be taken for granted. As recently as the early 1990s, about 90% of U.S. adults identified as Christians. But today, only 2/3 of adults are Christians. The change in America's religious composition is largely the result of large numbers of adults switching out of the religion in which they were raised to become religiously unaffiliated. In other words, the nuns, the people who don't really worship under any specific faith or worship at all. They think church is walking through the woods, perhaps, and looking at trees, and maybe then they don't even consider that as a creation of God, but of a whole bunch of gods, or just a Big Bang theory, and that's their faith, that's their religion. In other words, Pew writes, a steadily shrinking share of young adults who were raised Christian in childhood have retained their religious identity in adulthood over the past 30 years. At the same time, having no religious affiliation has become stickier. A declining percentage of people raised without a religion have converted or taken on a religion later in life. While religious switching is the focus of this report, other demographic forces that can cause religious change, transmission, migration, fertility, and mortality, will be briefly discussed in the second half of this survey. That's Pew talking about what's to come in this survey, and I'm certainly not going to read it all. Let me read this little section here: generational snowball. Whatever the deeper causes for the switch in religion we're talking about, from Christianity to unaffiliated, religious disaffiliation in the United States is being fueled by switching patterns that started snowballing from generation to generation in the 1990s. So Christian all along, all the decades in America. Then suddenly the 1990s come, and there's a snowball effect of people abandoning the faith, which is interesting because most people would say the 1960s is when America really went down the secular cesspool. And you can make a case for that too, but according to Pew, speaking to people, interviewing people, polling people, it was the 1990s where they really switched out of Christianity, the actual Christian belief, and moved into the religious unaffiliated. The core population of nuns, Pew writes, has an increasingly sticky identity as it rolls forward, and it is gaining a lot more people than it is shedding in a dynamic that has a kind of demographic momentum. Christians have experienced the opposite pattern. With each generation, progressively fewer adults retain the Christian identity they were raised with, which in turn means fewer parents are raising their children in Christian households. I don't think you need a survey to tell you that this is indeed true. All you have to do is look around at the cultural decay that's taken place in America since the 1990s. I did not have sex with that woman. It depends on what the meaning of is. That kind of cultural decay that has become accepted, that has been excusable, that has now, fast forward to 2024, has even become embraced, right? So if you're the person out there that is saying morals matter, standards of behavior matter, you are not in the majority. As a matter of fact, you are so far in the minority that you are labeled as discriminatory and intolerant and bigoted and hate-filled and hateful, right? So this is how very, very quickly evil can seep into a nation and change the mindsets and hearts of all those it infects. It becomes the norm, and then good becomes the abnormal. And so if you're looking for reasons to raise your kids Christian instead of just nuns or whatever faith they want to hang on to or grab a hold of, then certainly you can look around at what's taking place in America's culture and find cause there to go back to the old times, go back to the old ways of the pre-1990s and start taking a second look at Bible-based truths and how to raise your kids in sound, biblically strong homes so that they are armed. They are properly armed with the weapons they need to fight off all the evil that's seeped into America and really just flipped our nation, good for evil, evil for good. And that's where we're at right now. But basically, it's not just about the founding of America and the roots of America and the things that keep us free in America. That's all well and good and true and sound. The idea that Judeo-Christian belief is not only what our nation was based upon, but what actually keeps us free, because those who take their marching orders from God don't need government to tell them what to do. It's as founding fathers said, those who are moral and virtuous are capable of self-governance. So Judeo-Christian principles keep us free. But more than that, it's about what God does in the life of an individual. And if you are a believer, then you already know this. You already know what my guest is going to talk about. You already have your own story, your own faith journey that pulls you through and keeps you on the straight and narrow, and you understand what God does for the individual. But if you're a non-believer, or you're on the fence, or you're someone who is part of the nuns mentality that one faith is as good as another, and worshiping, a tree and nature is as good as going to church and actually worshiping God, and reading the Bible is the same as reading any old book. Well, then maybe you will appreciate the story of my guest today, because this is the season of Jesus Christ. This is when we celebrate his birth, except for the far leftist, secular types that want to say Christmas has nothing to do with Christ. It's all about the worship of the tree and Gaia or whatever. And maybe that's how they live their lives. Maybe that's what they do. But Christmas has Christ right in the name. It's more than just a happy coincidence. I think most people recognize that Christmas is the time to recognize Christ's birth. And what better way to recognize his birth and all he has done for humanity than by listening to someone talk about their own personal faith and their faith journey. And that's what my guest today is going to do. Billy Hallowell. You know him. He is a colleague at the Washington Times, but he has a rich, deep history of covering faith issues. He has books, movies, podcasts, video shows, you name it. And Billy's got his name all on faith and the juncture of faith with politics and faith and morality and biblical truths and so forth. And today he's here to talk about his own faith journey, because it's very interesting, and I love hearing from people about how they came to Christ. So without further ado, Billy Hallowell, thank you so much for being on Bold and Blonde. It is so great to have you here.
Well, I always love getting to come on your show, so I appreciate you asking me back.
Yeah, and it's the Christmas season, and you and I are both believers, and this is just the perfect opportunity to talk about faith journeys. And I'm curious about your upbringing and how you came to know Christ, and whatever you want to say about that. How were you raised, first off?
Yeah, it's funny. So I'm an only child, and I was raised in a home in upstate New York, and both of my parents grew up Catholic, but had left the Catholic Church and really essentially became evangelical Christians. And they had me fairly young. I mean, they were around 20, 21 years old. And so I remember them in their 20s. I always joke, I remember them being young, as a kid. And they were always cool. They were always, interesting young people, but they were Christians. And, we listened to a lot of Christian music, and I grew up going to church. And it's interesting because I look back now, and I'm 41 now, and so I look back at this journey, and I loved growing up in a Christian home. But I think now, when I look at where I am in my heart understanding of faith, I think I had sort of a head understanding of faith as a kid, right? You grow up, you're being taken to church, you're being told all these things. As a kid, I wasn't really picking up the Bible myself. I was going to Sunday school and hearing it from other people, and I think that's a common experience, and I'm really grateful for that. But it really wasn't until, if I'm fully honest, until I got deep into my 30s, my early 30s, and then deep into my 30s, where I really understood it, and it all really came together for me. So if you had asked me in my 20s, are you a Christian? I would have said, yes, I was going to Bible studies. I was even leading them. But it really took me a while to kind of come into that. But I am so grateful, because I know other people, maybe even your own experience, they didn't have that upbringing, right? Or they fell away from it and they came back later. So I definitely fell away and had those moments, but it was that rooting that kind of always brought me back.
So was it when you had children was that the turning point where you sought out a deeper relationship with Christ or understanding of biblical truths, or was it something else?
Yeah, that's such a good question. It really, I think there were a series of moments of loss and struggle that make you reassess. And we all go through this, right? Where the first one was probably when I was around 16. There was, my mom actually had a miscarriage pretty far along. And it was, I was a 16-year-old. It was kind of a traumatic event for everybody in the family. And that was the first moment where you start, especially when you're young and you're not fully understanding, not that we don't do this as adults, but I had this moment of frustration with God. Why did this have to happen? And we can all relate to that. And I think that was the first moment where I started to think deeper. Then went to college and didn't make always the best decisions. They weren't horrible decisions, but they weren't always great. And having to kind of recalibrate and say, well, how was I raised? Is this what I was raised to do or think? No, I was raised to believe in truth and believe in eternal truth. And what does that mean? And so starting to kind of dig into, my really owning that faith journey myself, then having, going through with my wife, getting married, and our first actual pregnancy was a miscarriage. And so I was then revisiting that sort of pain again and asking different questions, And so then becoming a parent, yes, I think that was the first time. And I don't know if you can relate to this, but when, you're working in media or you're trying to build a career, and I think a lot of people can relate to this, just kind of scrambling to try to make a name for myself and thinking about honoring myself and all these things that were so self-focused, having kids, makes you reassess that, because you realize very quickly that even if you're continuing to be self-focused, it doesn't really work. It doesn't jive with being a good parent. And so that's a journey for all of us. But that was another moment where I realized, okay, this is amazing parenthood, and I have this responsibility. This is my priority. And you start to think about, what is God, how does God view us when we look at our own kids and that love that we have? And so that was a big turning point for me. And then really, to be honest with you, the other one was working at The Blaze and being the faith editor there, and, being a Christian, but saying to myself internally, well, I want to cover politics. I don't really want to cover faith. And God just pushing me into that role. And then story after story of life change, getting to cover those stories actually really made me stop and focus on the deeper meaning behind what it was I said I believed. And I know that was a TED Talk, but there were all those moments, and then the job itself that really pushed me deeper.
Not a TED Talk, interesting bullet points. And insofar as what you said about The Blaze, I find that interesting because, as you know, I told you before, it was when I was reading The Blaze that I first discovered your work, and I became a big admirer of what you did. So it's a little bit funny to me now to hear you say that, oh, I want to cover politics. And so I just thought, well, it was at The Blaze when you were covering faith, and I thought, wow, what an awesome job. I would love to do what he does, what Billy does. So I want to go back to what you said about self-focus, because that's very interesting, because I think sometimes it's hard to be a good Christian, for lack of a better phrase, in America, where it is so self-driven, right? It's all about capitalism and achievement and accomplishment and money. And it's almost like a constant battle.
Yeah, no, it's a constant battle, and if you're not careful, it usurps your life. You become, especially in media, like, oh, I want to go do TV hits. I want to go to Fox News. I had all these goals and these things I wanted to do, and there's nothing wrong with having goals. But I think the thing that was missing for me, and I know for a fact people listening will relate to this, and maybe they're even struggling with it now, when all the things you want are not lining up with what you're supposed to be doing, or maybe they are by accident, but you haven't really been asking God. I found myself living a life where I was pushing for things that were not bad things. They were just what you said, right? Living that American dream out, but they were things that maybe weren't what I was supposed to be doing. And the minute I had that recalibration, and I'll tell you, leaving The Blaze was the hardest thing professionally I ever did, because I loved The Blaze, and to willingly leave that job behind, I felt like I was leaving my identity behind. I had my whole identity wrapped up in this position that I was doing for 5.5 years. And when I left that, I was like, I don't have the platform I had. I don't have any of these things that I wanted so badly. But I started listening to God and saying, okay, God, what do you want me to do? And he opened some weird doors, some strange doors, some doors that I was like, why am I doing this job? I don't understand it. But now I'm in a place where I could say, you know what? I want to do what God wants me to do. And once you line that up, the American dream, you can still recognize it, but you want the dream to be God's dream that's guiding your life for you and where you're supposed to be, and everything else should come secondary. And that is a tough lesson. And I still have to check myself at moments and say, okay, is this what I should do, or is it what I want to do? And those things don't always line up. But I will tell you, the most reward, and you know this, I mean, the biggest rewards in life come when you turn and say, okay, God, I'm going to do what you want me to do. I'm going to say what you want me to say. I'm going to talk to the people you want me to talk to. And that's where I always want to be now.
So I'm listening with deep interest to what you say because I think that what you're talking about resonates with a lot of people, a lot of well-meaning Christians who want to do right. But one of the questions we, however you want to put it, often have is, how do I know if that's God's voice or if that's just something within me guiding me that way? So I imagine that you struggled with the same when you ask questions of God. Is it you? Is it God telling you this? What words of, I don't know, experience and wisdom can you give on that point?
Yeah, I think that is a big struggle for people too, because they'll sometimes feel a certain way and they'll be like, oh, well, that feeling's from God. And it's like, well, not always. A lot of times our feelings get us into a lot of trouble. And I think, being in the Word, which for those who aren't familiar with that Christianese term, reading the Bible, praying, doing those things that I wasn't really doing, by the way, when I was living that life where I was trying to do those things and, doing the jobs I was doing, I wasn't picking up my Bible every day. I would read, but it was sporadic. I really shifted in 2020 towards reading the Bible every day, making sure I was engaging in Scripture in some way. That may look different, right? It may be that in fact, you and I were talking earlier today, and we were talking, offline about some of these things, how we read. In 2025, I want to read more about the church fathers and the early church. But the point is being connected to God and definitely being in prayer. When we're doing those things, we have a better chance of obviously getting the answers. And you may not hear a voice. Some people do. I've not had, my communication with God has not been that way, but I will tell you, and I'll share this example because it had to do with a job. I was working in a job not all that long ago, and I was like, God, you need to get me out of this job. I just felt that I needed to leave. And I was like, but I want it to be your will. And I prayed on a Thursday, and this does not happen a lot to me, okay? So this is not like a common experience for me. I said, God, give me, some answers, please. If it's your will for me to get out of this job and to find something else, please open a door. And literally 12 hours later, somebody reached out to me through my website with a job offer. Somebody else talked about me coming back to a job I had previously had, and a third person had reached out about a potential job, and all of it was mostly unprompted. And, so sometimes you get that kind of communication from God, and that to me was like such a confirmation. And I ended up, and I want to share this too, because I think this is important. You start looking at the salaries for these jobs, and there was a job that I was really attracted to. I thought this would be really good, but there was something holding me back, and I knew it was God, and the salary was way higher than the other two jobs. And I ended up, and this is one of the only times I had really done this, taking the lower paying job, and I'm talking like it was by a lot of money, because I knew that lower paying job was where he wanted me to be, and it ended up being an amazing experience. So anyway, that's a lot of information to say. I think we just need to listen more, and we need to be giving him time.
And I think when you read your Bible every day, it almost serves as a defensive means, right? So you sort of lay the foundation for your day, so the issues that do come up where you might have questions, you feel at peace with what comes to mind in terms of the answers, because you've already grounded yourself in God's Word. Do you feel that as well?
Absolutely. And I think, well, I know this. I mean, you look at Ephesians 6, and it talks about the spiritual battle that we're in, and there's so many confusing messages, and there's so much chaos going on. When you're in the Bible and you're reading, you have a clarity, right? And there's less of a haze, and you can see things for what they are. And I think it guides you naturally more towards making those right choices and seeking God in a more natural way. A lot of times people are only going to God when somebody dies, when somebody's sick, when there's some question, when we get terrible news. And when you're with God every day, it becomes a lot easier to have that natural relationship that gives you, I think, that communication, right? So, yeah, I would agree with that. And I bring up Ephesians 6 only because I think I under-spiritualized everything in life. It's possible to over-spiritualize it, but we have to be aware that there are a lot of forces around us that are trying to knock us off course. And so that having that mindset has really helped me navigate life better.
And they're not in your face forces either, right? They come quietly, so you don't even recognize them as something from the devil or anything like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wonder, do you think being raised in a faith home, do you think Has that made it more difficult for you to relate to those who haven't been and who have suffered at the hands of some really dark sin, addictions, and all kinds of dark things? Are you able, because of your Christian upbringing, to understand the roots of their issues, or is it a struggle?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think that telling other people's stories so often, which has been the door that God has opened, and oftentimes, the ex porn star who becomes a pastor. I mean, these wild
Yes.
stories that has actually made it easier for me to understand. I think if we were having this conversation and I did some other job where I didn't have those conversations and hear people's pain, because when you hear people, and you know this, I mean, you've had these conversations, talk about leaving this horrific life behind and what they felt like when they were in that life and what it was like, and then finding Jesus and how healed they were, that I have been able to really understand that. I don't think I would. I think I struggled with that before I did this job. And before so, and I think that is hard for a lot of people. I also do feel like, and maybe this is just my experience, the people who have gone through those crazy things or the tough things and they've come out of it and found faith and they weren't raised with it, they sometimes end up with a deeper, more abiding faith in how they live it out. Whereas I think it's often a struggle for people who grow up with it. They sort of take it for granted. It's sort of this milquetoast, not always, but this is how I live my life, and I'm a Christian. But I have found that those stories are incredible because when you go through it, you really know how to live it the right way after, right? And it's just different.
Do you think anything could shake your faith at this point?
Oh gosh, it's dangerous to say no, right? Because
Without inviting a test.
It's like, please, I've had enough. I don't need it. I don't think so. I mean, I think at this point, there are always questions and little doubts that people have, right, that will pop up. And I think the best thing to do is to answer those questions. Even my 9-year-old has been asking really good questions. She said to me the other day, do you ever get afraid, Daddy, that what if, the other people who believe other things, what if they have it right and you have it wrong? And I thought, what a good question. I wasn't thinking that way when I was 9. I said, well, that's a normal question to have. And I actually think it's a healthy question to have because then you want to look for evidence, right? You want to understand what is the evidence that proves what I believe. And when you dig into the evidence of Christianity, it's amazing. I mean, from archaeological evidence down to even, at Christmas time, here we are, and we're celebrating this holiday of the birth of Jesus. And it's a birth that really was prophesied hundreds of years before in Scripture, and Jesus proves all of these things again and again, and there's so much there. So I think the point is it brings you to that proof. And so for me, there's so much evidence and proof that it would take, I can't even imagine what it would take for me to say, none of this is true, and to turn away from it. So no, I don't think anything would rock my faith. Can there be challenges to faith when there's a struggle? Absolutely. But I think for Christians, we know that even when we have those human emotions of God, why, that we can come back and understand once the emotions have sort of settled, that there is a broader, bigger plan that we just don't understand. We're not God, right? So we can ask those questions all day long, and I think God understands us asking them, but we have to remember that he knows the full entirety of the plan, and we don't.
Wow, time flies, Billy. Billy Hallowell, I want to thank you so much for sharing your faith with me and with Bold and Blunt listeners. I'm a big admirer of your work, and I know that you have a movie, a documentary out there. Just promote it really quickly, as well as whatever other books or works you have going on right now.
Sure. There's actually 2 projects that I'd love to bring up. One is the Prophecies of Christmas. And even if you hear this after Christmas, you can go to CBN News, the Quick Start podcast. We also have our own feed it's called the Jesus and the Prophecies of Christmas, where you can listen to the 4 episodes. It's documentary style, and it actually deals with the proof of the nativity, the prophecies that I mentioned in the Old Testament, how Jesus fulfills them. It's a pretty easy listen. You can listen to it in under 2 hours, all 4 episodes. And it's Greg Laurie, Ray Comfort, lots of great people, Candace Cameron Bure, and you can hear them talk through all of this in documentary style. And then we have a documentary film coming out, CBN News, next year. It'll be early next year. I don't know the precise date yet. But it's called Investigating the Supernatural Miracles, and it's all about miracles, real-life miracles, where I go and I investigate them, and we give you the evidence. And whether you're an atheist or a Christian, you look at that evidence and you can see these incredible things that have unfolded, and you can decide whether or not you believe those things. And so you can find out more about that at CBN News as well.
Truly, there are miracles every day, right, for believers. So I can't wait to watch that, and I look forward to listening to that 4-part series. It's going to be phenomenal. Billy Hallowell, thank you once again for being on Bold and Blunt. We'll be in touch soon.
Thank you.
Love to hear people's stories of faith. So great, so inspirational, especially at Christmas time. So Merry Christmas to you. And remember, if you like Bold and Blunt, you may get Bold and Blunt at edify.app, at Real Life Network, at WashingtonTimes.com, and wherever podcasts are available. Tune in next time. And don't forget, stay blunt, stay bold.
Marketing is hard. But I'll tell you a little secret. It doesn't have to be. Let me point something out. You're listening to a podcast right now, and it's great. You love the host. You seek it out and download it. You listen to it while driving, working out, cooking, even going to the bathroom. Podcasts are a pretty close companion. And this is a podcast ad. Did I get your attention? You can reach great listeners like yourself with podcast advertising from Libsyn Ads. Choose from hundreds of top podcasts offering host endorsements, or run a pre-produced ad like this one across thousands of shows to reach your target audience in their favorite podcasts with Libsyn Ads. Go to libsynads.com, that's Libsyn, ads.com today.